All right, I think we're going to go ahead and get started here, everyone. So first off, I want to welcome you to today's webinar. My name is Andy Surwich from Altera Software, and today we're going to be talking about how to migrate to VMware, and this is specifically geared towards existing Hyper-V administrators. So this is it's what I would call something of a contentious topic. You know, I found during my years of experience that people's chosen hypervisor is, people get really passionate about their chosen hypervisor. So, this webinar is not intended to be a bashing session on any particular webinar. What I found over the last couple of years especially is that a lot of administrators are finding themselves in a situation where they have to support both hypervisors in their environment. That could be because of some sort of company acquisition, or maybe their IT department has made a decision to transition to a different hypervisor. Maybe you're an MSP or some sort of service provider that you have to support both platforms, and you could very well find yourself in a situation where you need to move from one to the other. Now, last month we did basically the same webinar, only we did it from the standpoint of how to migrate to Hyper-V from VMware. Well, we figured that we should do it the other way as well, and that's why we put on the webinar today. So this webinar is really designed to, one, give you a good foundational introduction to the vSphere platform. What are the major components? What's the high-level architecture look like? What are the management tools in play? And finally, how do you get your workloads there? How do you move your existing either physical machines or your Hyper-V VMs? How do you move them into virtual machines on top of the vSphere platform? And that's really what we're going to cover today. Quick note about the management tools. I'm going to be demoing some of the management tools later. We're going to talk about some of them. There's way too much content in just the management tools to cover all of it in each little individual piece. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to make sure that I cover each of the major highlights. Like I said, that way you have a good foundational understanding of how to get started and where certain things are. And I'll be sure to point out the differences between Hyper-V and the relevant components inside of vSphere. So let's talk about our agenda. So first off, we're going to do some introductions of myself, of Altera, the sponsor. I'm going to talk about vSphere architecture from a high level. What does it look like? I'm going to talk about the key differences. Then we're going to get into management tools and some management tool demos, like I said. We'll show you the major components, the major pieces that you need to be aware of there. Then we're going to talk about the vSphere Converter Standalone. That is your primary tool that you're going to be using when you're migrating workloads into vSphere. And then finally, we'll wrap up with some Q&A at the end. So one thing I want to mention about the Q&A, feel free to use the questions form inside of GoToWebinar here to ask your questions as you think of them while I'm doing my spiel. I've got a buddy of mine on the webinar today. His name's Luke Oriana. He's a fellow blogger of ours over at the Altera VMware and Hyper-V blogs. He's going to be on the line. He's going to answer the questions that he can answer for us, and he's just kind of going to be helping us on the sidelines. So thanks, Luke, for helping us out today. And then the questions that he isn't able to get to, or we'll be covering those during the Q&A session at the end of the webinar as well. One other thing on the Q&A, a lot of times we don't have enough time to get through all the questions. It's very common in our webinars. So what we always do is we do a follow-up blog post out on the, this one will be out on our Hyper-V blog. And basically that follow-up post will include a recording of today's webinar. It'll include a link to where you can download the slide deck and get all these slides that I'm about to show you. And it'll include a full list of the questions and the answers, even the ones that we don't cover during the Q&A today. So if you ask a question, you don't get the answer for it, be sure to check that follow-up post later on that will have your question and answer. So again, my name is Andy Surwich. I'm a technical evangelist for Altera Software, the sponsor of today's webinar. And I'm also a Microsoft Cloud and Data Center Management MVP. Before that, I was just a Hyper-V MVP. The Hyper-V group kind of got pulled up into this Cloud and Data Center Management group. Again, technical evangelist for Altera Software. I've been doing this I've been in IT for 14, 15 years now, working across several industry verticals, different size businesses from the SMB all the way up to the huge mega enterprise. So my main focuses have always been in virtualization, cloud services, the Microsoft server stack with an emphasis on Hyper-V and VMware. So a common thing that I always get asked, my bio here, I have Hyper-V plastered all over it, Yes, I like Hyper-V. I work with Hyper-V a lot, but I like VMware too, and I work with VMware a lot. Before I came on board with Altero, I worked for a managed services provider that provided private hosted clouds for their customers. And it was a pretty big infrastructure, a lot of customers on board, and that infrastructure was based around VMware technologies. So it was my responsibility to keep track and maintain and take care of that infrastructure. So I've been around VMware for a lot of years. Cut my teeth on ESX3 and 3.5, which seem really old now, but I like both platforms. I think both platforms have merit. They're both solid platforms. And when people ask me, well, what is your preferred one? It's tough for me to answer that, because really the answer I always give is, at the end of the day, it just depends on whose ecosystem you want to be in. That's really what it comes down to. They're both capable hypervisors, and it just comes down to personal preference. So if we have any Twitter folks on the line that like to use Twitter, I'm very active on Twitter. My handle is @aserwich right there towards the bottom, and I blog quite regularly out on Altero's blogs, altero.com/hyper-v and /VMware, respectively. To talk about the sponsor again today, a little bit about them. My employer is Altero Software. We're a fast-growing developer of some pretty awesome backup software designed specifically for the SMB, mid-market, and MSPs. We're trusted by 30,000 customers and 6,000 partners and MSPs worldwide, and that flagship product is Altero VM Backup. If you're interested in more information regarding that product, you can go out to altero.com/VM-backup for more information. So whenever I give a talk like this, I always like to set some expectations first. I've talked to this a little bit already, in that when it comes to IT pros' chosen hypervisors, they tend to get really passionate about their chosen hypervisor. And I just want to say up front, this course, this webinar is not designed to be a bashing session. I'm not going to be saying things like, VMware is so much better because of X, Y, and Z, and Hyper-V is so much better because A, B, and C, and I'm not going to be doing things like that. This is an objective look at how to move from one platform to the other, because like I said earlier, a lot of IT pros are finding themselves in that situation. And like I said, I like both platforms. They both perform very well, and it just depends whose ecosystem you want to be in. So I always like to set that expectation first, that this is not a bashing session, just an objective look. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to do a crash course on VMware. Again, we're going to cover the core components, the core pieces that you need to be aware of to get started in that platform. And I'm going to do it from the perspective of a Hyper-V administrator, and I'll be sure to point out the key differences and which components correlate with the same components on the Hyper-V side, to give you a better idea of what these particular vSphere features do. So let's talk about high-level architecture first, because on the Hyper-V side, you know that you've got Hyper-V is just an installable role. You install it on your Windows server to host up virtual machines, and if you want HA and clustering, you have to install the failover clustering feature and configure it and get it going. You're very familiar with that process if you've been a Hyper-V administrator for a while. But what does it look like on the VMware side? What you're going to find here is it looks very similar, but there is, one or two differences. So on the VMware side, if you want, just like in Hyper-V, you can have a standalone hypervisor. So in this case, we've got a standalone ESXi host. It's got some local storage. I start installing some VMs on it, and I want to serve out those workloads to the physical network via my physical network. And you can do that just the same as you can in Hyper-V. You can run a standalone host, and there's nothing wrong with that. But that's not useful for all situations. A lot of businesses need some sort of uptime guarantee. They need some sort of failover and HA, and you can do that with VMware just like you can with Hyper-V. So we have multiple hosts. In this case, we got 2 ESXi hosts. You could do more than this if you want, up to 64 nodes in an ESXi cluster, just like Hyper-V. And just like Hyper-V, I need some sort of shared storage amongst those different nodes. So in the VMware world, this could be an iSCSI LUN, this could be an NFS share, it could be a fiber channel LUN, could even be vSAN. vSAN is VMware's equivalent to the new storage spaces direct. Those are the 2 features that kind of correlate there. And it's just got to be some sort of shared storage for those virtual machines to live on, and to allow virtual machines to move from one host to another. So that brings us to the cluster and VM traffic. You have to have some sort of networking between your cluster nodes that allows the cluster traffic to move between them, and for when you want to vMotion virtual machines from one to the other. vMotion is VMware's version of live migration. It's just you're moving a VM live from one host to the other for maintenance, whatever. Same reasons as you'd use live migration. Now, one key difference here is in the Hyper-V world, you have the full clustering, you have full HA, full virtualization just with Windows Server, Hyper-V role, and the failover clustering feature. But in the VMware side, in order to get that HA and clustering, you need vCenter. vCenter is an additional software package that has to be installed. Can be installed on a Windows box, but they have a appliance that they actually recommend you use these days. This could be a physical device, but they really recommend that it live on a virtual machine inside of the cluster. That way it can take advantage of things like high availability, vMotion, all the things that VMs can take advantage of in a vSphere cluster. So you need vCenter in order to get that clustering, high availability, and things like that. So that is one of the key differences. So let's talk about licensing tiers. Microsoft tends to keep things, well, I shouldn't say simple, but simpler than they used to be when it comes to licensing. Really, you've got the standard and the data center editions of Windows Server, and for the most part, you have feature parity between the 2 of them. I think the only big difference is data center has storage spaces direct and standard does not. The other big difference is how many virtual machines that you can run based on the edition. So standard Windows Server gives you 2 virtual machine instances, and data center gives you unlimited. VMware, we have a little bit more complication here because they have several different licensing tiers. So the first one is the vSphere Essentials Kit. There's an Essentials Plus as well, which is kind of an upgraded version of this. But really, the Essentials are the best fit for, like a small installation. You have an SMB or maybe like a remote office, branch office type of thing. And it's really intended for a maximum of 3 hosts that have 2 CPUs each. Anything over and above that, you need to start going to the standard edition. And Essentials really includes all the common stuff that you're looking for, vMotion, HA, those are the 2 really important ones that a lot of people want. Then we go to standard. This is really the common entry point for organizations that have 4 or more hosts. This includes things like storage vMotion, which is the equivalent of live storage migration. You get fault tolerance here, you get vVols, a couple of additional features. And then you have Enterprise Plus. And Enterprise Plus is really intended for, again, that enterprise space. You get things like container services, you get OpenStack integration if you want, virtual machine encryption, which is kind of VMware's version of shielded VMs, and DRS, which stands for Distributed Resource Scheduler. DRS is really the equivalent to Hyper-V's load balancing, where it will actually load balance the virtual machines between nodes inside of the cluster. And DRS is really a nice feature. I would say that's a little bit better than Hyper-V's load balancing, and that it can do a lot of fancy things. And I'll be sure to point those out inside of the management interfaces when we get there a little bit later. I kind of spoke to this already. Windows licensing information. In the Hyper-V world, you need these licenses, and they give you Hyper-V and failover clustering. But if you want to run VMware as your hypervisor, you still have to buy these licenses. You still have to license the Windows machines the VMs running on top of your VMware infrastructure. So the same rules apply. You know, the standard edition gives you 2 VMs running on top of your VMware host. The data center edition gives you unlimited Windows VMs on top of your VMware host. So same rules apply there. What you want to do is you want to make sure that you check in with your Microsoft rep and make sure that your the number of licenses you have is exactly what you need for your environment. And then I wanted to add a slide here about what are the key differences from Hyper-V. So the first one is vCenter is native for cluster. I kind of covered that one already. So that's definitely one that you need to take into account because there is additional licensing costs associated there. So definitely you want to take a look at that, and you have to plan for some infrastructure. You need some CPU and memory to accommodate that vCenter instance as well. So definitely plan for that. Hardware support. While it's good for VMware, it is more strict than Hyper-V. So with Hyper-V, Microsoft had the benefit of already having this Windows kernel out there with the wide support of hardware offerings that it had. So Hyper-V does a really good job of working in all these different wide array of different hardware. VMware, they have a little bit of a harder time with this. They support a smaller subset of hardware, and they have this list out there that they call the hardware compatibility list. And I've got the link here. And again, I'll be sure to provide the slides in the follow-up blog post so you can come in here and grab this. But this is a link that you're definitely going to want to bookmark if you are in the position of supporting vSphere environments on a regular basis. Basically, anytime you make a hardware change, you want to come in there and make sure that the hardware is supported by the version of vSphere that you're looking to install. Additionally, not only does this show hardware compatibility information, it shows software compatibility information as well. So what versions of vSphere products are supported with other versions of vSphere products and things like that. I mean, it's really, I think these days they're calling it the hardware compatibility matrix because it's really more than just hardware compatibility list. So definitely you want to be sure to reference that when you're speccing out a new installation or you're looking at migration. Management is nearly 100% web-based via Flash or HTML5. On the Hyper-V side, you have Hyper-V Manager, you have Failover Cluster Manager, which are both MMC snap-ins. You've got Virtual Machine Manager if you're running System Center in your environment. You've got PowerShell. So you've got all these different management utilities, and all of them are installable on whatever machine you're using to manage that solution. vSphere, they used to have an installable client called the vSphere client. It was a C# based utility, and you use that to manage the solution, but they've gone entirely web-based, and for a while it was Flash based, and it still is, but they've been working on this new HTML5 web-based console, and it's really a lot better, and from a security perspective it's a lot better too, because you're not relying on Flash, which is every IT pro's favorite security issue after Java. But it's nice having it all web-based because you don't have to install any tools. You just open a web page and away you go. Some features are at a cluster level as opposed to a per VM level. The big one here is HA. I always like to point this one out. Whereas in Hyper-V, you go and you enable HA on a per virtual machine basis. In the VMware world, it's per cluster. So you enable it on the cluster layer, and every virtual machine inside of that cluster is enabled for HA at that point. So just something to be aware of. And you are unable to install anything on the host directly. While it's not recommended, I've seen a lot of people install software directly on the Hyper-V hosts. And Microsoft supports that in the instance that software that's installed at the host layer is actually used in the support of the virtualization solution, such as backup software is the example I always give. But I see a lot of people install third-party software, all kinds of different stuff on the host layer. If you're doing something like that and you need to be able to do that once you move to VMware, you're not going to be able to install it on the host. VMware provides their own operating system essentially for their hypervisor, and it's not Windows-based. So you're not going to be able to install those applications at the host level. You will have to make a new virtual machine and install that software inside of a VM. So just something to plan on there. And then finally, we've got the commonly asked for config maximums. I usually try not to talk about these during these talks because it always turns into this, well, Hyper-V can do this many more vCPUs, or VMware can do this much memory, and it always turns into this boxing match, you know. But I mean, the reality is that the maximums for both platforms are so insanely high that most of us are never going to be supporting hardware of that size. I mean, these maximums really are like for, you know, the Amazons and the Ciscos and the huge mega enterprises of the world. But these are some common ones, you know, 128 vCPUs per VM, 6 terabytes of memory per VM, 62 terabyte VMDK capacity. VMDK is the VMware equivalent of VHD and VHDX. It's just VMware's virtual hard disk file extension. You can do just over 1,000 VMs per host, assuming the host has enough resources to handle that. And you can do 64 physical nodes per vSphere cluster, just like Hyper-V. So let's talk about management tools. So it's a bit different than Hyper-V. And I will say that this is an area where I feel like VMware does a little bit better job. You know, we've always had all these different disparate management tools on the Hyper-V side. VMware's done a really good job of always having kind of this one tool that you go to. And I say 3 different management tools here, and that's really because depending on what you're managing, you access it a little bit different way, but generally it's pretty similar between all 3 here. So the first you have is the vSphere host client, just a web-based interface, and it's primarily used for managing a single standalone host. Then you have vCenter, which again, just a web interface. You point your web browser at the vCenter server, and it's used for managing clusters of all sizes, from 2 hosts all the way up to hundreds and hundreds of hosts. Whereas on the Hyper-V side, you know, you talk about cluster manager. I usually say cluster manager can't really be used to manage any more than 40 hosts is kind of the cutoff I've been going with lately. Anything over and above that, now you're talking about System Center, getting a virtual machine manager in there. So you've got all these different disparate tools on the Hyper-V side. Power CLI. VMware provides their own PowerShell module, which you can use to use, you know, for things like scripting and automation. I'm going to show you a great demo here shortly on using that. And then if you are in an environment where you're managing both for an extended period of time, and if you do have System Center VMM in your environment, you can use that to manage vSphere as well. You can actually add in the vCenter server into VMM, and you can do some basic management tasks all from that one interface, which is kind of nice. So let's do a quick demo of some management tools. So let me exit the slideshow here. The first thing I wanted to show you is this interface here. So when you install ESXi, which is vSphere's hypervisor, onto a server, this is the view you're going to get. This is all you're going to see on the console. Very, very slimmed down UI here. And basically the only thing you're going to use this for is setting passwords on the host itself and configuring the management IP address. So you can see here, you know, the host name, IP address, and you got a couple of controls down here at the bottom. If I want to, I don't want to exit. This is the baseboard management controller on that particular host, and looks like it might have timed out on me. But normally you'd be able to hit F2, log in as root, and you just have some basic text menus that you can work through to set the IP address and things like that. There's not a whole lot to do on the host itself. Once you've got that all configured, you can come over here, and this is the host client. This is that interface that you're going to use for managing standalone hosts. And by default on standalone ESXi hosts, you're going to log in with root or some other username and password that you create. So let me see if I can do this without fat fingering my password. There we go. And as you can see, it's a real nice, clean web UI with a lot of information readily available here. So I can see my host name, I can see versions, what's the state of the machine, how much uptime, you know, some basic resource metrics here on the right. What you're going to see throughout this host UI here during my demo, you're going to see several mentions of this, about it being managed by a vCenter server. If this was truly a standalone host, you wouldn't see these, but being this particular host is being managed by a vCenter instance, it's going to let us know several times throughout the UI. The other thing we can see here is, hardware information, basic configuration information, performance summary for the last hour. So you can see here that, my memory has been pretty much spot on for the last hour, while my CPU has not been doing a whole lot, but it's been moving up and down. So that's kind of a nice place to get some basic performance information. We can see storage and the different networks that we have configured on this particular host. There's a number of different areas that you can go through here to manage the host itself. We've got things like swap settings for it, time and date, different hardware devices that we can look at, software packages. Licensing is where you'd go to actually put in your license key. One area that I always like to point out here is services. There are some times with vSphere where you need to remote in to a host via the command line. You do that using the SSH protocol, but by default, SSH is disabled on ESXi. If you ever need to do that, you got to come in here and you actually have to start this service, log in, do your work, log out once you're done, come back in here and turn that service off. Because from a security perspective, it's best practice to leave it off when you're not using it. Speaking of security, we got a number of different things that you can configure over here in security and users. You can join a domain, so you can have Active Directory authentication. You can set up certificates if you want, all kinds of different stuff in here. Configure roles. If you have multiple technicians logging into this host, you don't want all of them to have the same rights, you can come in here and make some changes. All kinds of different stuff. The next area that I really want to point out here is the virtual machines view. So here we can see all the different virtual machines that are running on the host. Green arrow means that they're running. These two are turned off. But really, just like the Hyper-V side, you can right-click these and you come down to Edit Settings. And here we get that very familiar resource view for the virtual machine and all the different settings that are associated with this particular VM. So, we see CPU, hard disk, memory. Again, if I click this little warning box, it tells me, hey, this host resources are being managed by vCenter. Again, I said you'll see this several times throughout my demo because this host is attached to a vCenter instance. But you can modify these settings if you want. A number of different things down here, SCSI controllers. Just like editing a virtual machine inside of Hyper-V, you're very familiar and used to seeing a lot of these settings. The other thing I like to point out is down here in the VM options under boot, you get this forced BIOS set up. There are some rare instances where you need to boot a VM to an ISO after it's been built. You can come in here and you actually force the machine to boot into BIOS, so you can change that boot order if you need to. The other couple of things that I wanted to show in here, that way you at least know where they are. We've got storage. In VMware, they do storage a little bit differently than we do in the Hyper-V world. In Hyper-V world, usually we're attaching storage to some sort of file path on Hyper-V. So like by default with failover clusters, it's always C cluster storage, right? Well, in the VMware world, what they do is they actually create this VMFS data store. VMFS is a file system that VMware created for hosting virtual machines. And that file system gets put down on top of whatever storage you've configured. So in my case, data store 1 is the local storage on this ESX host. But the rest of these are all iSCSI LUNs that I have presented. These could be NFS shares too. They could be fiber channel LUNs. A lot of different options as far as storage go. It could be, a vSAN as well. But essentially, these are where you'll actually store your virtual machines. The other section I really wanted to touch in here was networking. Now, in the VMware world, while similar to Hyper-V as far as virtual networking goes, you have your vSwitches. So you see over here, I've got a vSwitch tab, and vSwitch 0, vSwitch 1. These are all used for different things, but VMware also has this concept of port groups, and a port group is just a collection of ports on that particular switch that are designated for a particular purpose. So you can see I have this prod net port group, and essentially this port group is my production network. And you can see here, if you drill down into that port group, Now you can see the association. It gives you this nice logical topology of what that particular virtual networking looks like. And I can see, in the middle here, I've got that vSwitch. So this is associated with vSwitch 0. Here we've got 4 virtual machines currently associated with this port group, and here are the ports, if you will, and it passes through to these 2 virtual NICs, which not virtual NICs, sorry, these physical NICs that are teamed, and this is how these VMs get out to the physical network. So it really gives you kind of a nice view as to how it's really laid out. I mean, it puts it in a form that makes it easy for us humans to look at it and say, I get how that's working. I get why that, how that's put together. So, and again, each of these sections here, you can drill down into monitoring, get a little bit more information on the particular section, but really from a high-level overview perspective, this is kind of what you're going to use for managing a single host. Now, if I need to manage multiple hosts, 200, 2,000, whatever, then we've got vCenter. And vCenter, you come in here and you connect your web browser to the host name of the vCenter server /UI. What this does, it'll get you to the HTML5 client. Now, I mentioned that there's still a Flash client in play, and the Flash client is still what they would call the production official way of doing it still, but they're putting all their active development behind this console you see right here. Everything is slowly getting moved into this HTML5 console, so I would highly recommend you get used to this console right out of the gate, because eventually that Flash console is going to go away. If you want to get to that Flash console, it's the host name of the vCenter server /vSphere-client instead of UI. But I wanted to show you this client today because it is the new emerging up-and-coming management tool, and it is far more secure, and it's actually quite a bit quicker too. The responsiveness is a lot better than the Flash version, and I just personally like it a lot better myself as well. So here you can see that there's a lot of stuff that's similar to the host client that I just got done showing you. I can look at a specific host I want and get a lot of the same type of information. But you also see that we've got, here's my vCenter instance here at the top. Here's my data center. So this particular cluster is in the city of Jenison where I live. That's why it's called Jenison. And I've got my cluster here. So I could have multiple clusters underneath this data center if I wanted. But here I can see I've got 2 hosts in this cluster. And I got a couple of different icons here. I always like to point out. This little pie icon is called a resource group. And in the VMware world, a resource group is simply a collection of resources that you have carved off for a specific purpose. And I've seen people use this for carving off resources for a particular department, or like in my case here, I've carved off resources for production and test dev. And I've set it up in a way that production always gets more than the test dev stuff does. There's a lot of different use cases for it here, but very useful for you to take a look at and use. The other icon that you see here is this little kind of like a dark blue circle surrounded by squares. That is a VApp. And what a VApp is it's a collection of virtual machines, and you put them all in a VApp because they are all associated to each other. The most common use case I've seen for that is when you have an application that depends on some sort of back-end database server and a front-end server, and that application doesn't work unless both of them are up and running. Putting them in a VApp simply allows you to manage them as a whole, start and stop them as a whole, et cetera, et cetera. So that's very useful in those particular situations. And here we can start going through all the different pieces of cluster settings. So what you see here on the screen now, I've selected the cluster, and I've got all these different tabs here. So just like in Hyper-V, where you'd go into Cluster Manager and you start making clustering changes, this is where you start making cluster changes for a vSphere cluster. So I come in here, I can click Configure, and now I have all my different cluster settings. DRS, which I mentioned earlier, that load balancing mechanism between hosts, you can control that here. You see I've got it set to fully automated. High availability. Again, that is a per cluster setting. It's not set individually on HVM like it is in Hyper-V. You can control how that functions here. And you just kind of go through the list. VMware EVC. What I always like to point out here with EVC, this is the equivalent of CPU compatibility in Hyper-V. This is another one of those features that is set on a per cluster level and not a per virtual machine level. So both of my hosts in this particular cluster are exactly the same, so I have no need for it. But if you have hosts that have slightly different hardware sets, you need to move virtual machines between them, you want to come in here and enable EVC so that you can do that. Now, one other thing I want to mention, just like on the Hyper-V side, this doesn't work very well if you're going between radically different CPU types. So this will not work if you've got one host with an Intel CPU and another host with an AMD CPU. That's not going to work. So they have to be relatively similar. And that hardware compatibility list that I showed you earlier, that will actually show you which different CPU versions will work in an EVC cluster together. So if that describes something that you're working with, that's definitely something you want to take a look at. In the sake of time, I'm not going to go through every little section. I could do a whole webinar just on vSphere clustering, but I wanted to point out the key areas. That way you at least know where to look. You can start doing some testing, and you can start getting comfortable managing the solution as opposed to Hyper-V. Now, the other thing that I mentioned earlier was Power CLI. Now, the other two management utilities are really great, when you're manually doing things, you're working on a project. But I find that a lot of administrators these days are having to do more with less. IT staffs are shrinking, but they're being asked to do more and more than they ever have been before. So a lot of places are turning to automation and scripting to help get things done a little bit quicker. And Power CLI really allows you to do some very cool things with vSphere. So on my machine, this is just my Windows laptop, I have Power CLI installed, and you can run just Power CLI manually if you want. I have it installed, and you can actually run this app, and it will give you kind of that interactive, type a command, go, type another command, go, type of window. But that's more of like a manual process, right? But if I'm actually doing some scripting, I want to come in here to PowerShell ISE and actually do some scripting. And you can actually run these Power CLI, these VMware commands inside of regular PowerShell. You just have to import the modules first. So I'm doing here this top line, number 4, I'm doing get module, get all the available VMware modules, and then I'm piping them to import modules. So let's do that real quick. And that's done. Now let's say I want to look at all the different VMware related commandlets inside of this PowerShell module. And look, I've got just a ton of them. Restart VM guest, remove DRS rule, just all kinds of different stuff. So there's definitely a lot that you can do with Power CLI. So before we can run any of those commands, though, we have to first connect to either an ESXi host or a vCenter instance. And I can do that with this connect VI server, and I designate the server parameter and the name of the vCenter instance. So by default, this will use the credentials of the currently logged in user, which my user account has access to that vCenter instance. If you're not in that situation, you can pass a -credential commandlet here to put in custom credentials if you want. Now, I connected to that earlier, so sometimes it'll take 10-15 seconds, but I connected to that earlier already, so that connection's already established. But I can see here, connected this vCenter server over this port with this user, so I know I'm connected now. So let's take a look at all the VMs running in that cluster. So if I issue get VM, here are all the different virtual machines running on that cluster, whether they're powered off, how many CPUs, how much memory, etc., etc. That's not a ton of information to go off of, right? So if I pipe the output of get VM to select object, and the star tells select object, give me everything you have for the output. If I run that, I get all kinds of different information, and this is returning that information for every single virtual machine, which may not be useful, right? Maybe we're looking at just a specific VM. So if I go down here, let's say we want to look at this particular virtual machine. We're trying to get information on this VM. I'm going to store the name of that VM inside of this variable, and then I'm going to git VM. We're basically running that git VM command again, but I'm targeting that VM specifically. And here I got all that optional information specifically for that virtual machine. I can see that's powered on. You know, here's the guest ID, how many CPUs, memory, hard disks, you know, used space, IDs, resource pools, all kinds of different information having to do with that VM. So let's actually do something with this VM. Let's say I want to stop this machine. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to capture the name of that VM here again, and I'm going to pipe it to stop VM guest. Now I could just do stop VM, but that's the equivalent of hitting the power button on the machine. Stop VM guest actually shuts down the guest operating system of the VM. So if we run that, it's going to ask me to verify, yes, I want to shut down that machine. And if we go look here in a couple of minutes, that machine will be turned off. For now, I'm going to continue on in the sake of time. So what I'm going to do last here is you can start doing some really fancy stuff with this scripting and automation with Power CLI. Let's say I want to deploy a new virtual machine using a VMware template. So let's say I've already created a template inside of vSphere. I want to deploy that template using settings that are contained inside of this customization specification. vSphere allows you to create what's called a customization specification. It includes you know, a lot of the sysprep type of information that you do on the Windows side. It includes things like your license key and things like that. It allows you to customize the VM as part of the deployment process. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to capture all this stuff in variables, and then with a single line item, I'm going to deploy a new virtual machine into that cluster using this template and this customization specification. So let me run that, and now I can see that the clone virtual machine operation is running. If I open this up, I see, oh, there's my shutdown command I issued earlier, and this virtual machine is turned off now, and I've got a virtual machine that's currently cloning, and there it is, new fancy VM. So that's kind of it for Power CLI and the management tools. Kind of a crash course. Again, a lot of information to cover quickly. The other thing I wanted to point out here, if I go back to the slide deck, I got to switch that around real quick. If you're interested in more Power CLI information, I've got a great script out on our VMware blog, altera.com/VMware. The link's down there on the right. Again, you get a copy of the slide deck in our follow-up post. Really, this script contains a lot of great information on how to deploy multiple VMs with Power CLI all at once. You can deploy entire data centers with this if you want to. And when I came up with the script, I designed it in a way so it would be easy to follow for beginners. Everything is done in a very sequential order. First we do step 1, step 2, step 3. I did it that way that would be easy to follow and for people to learn from it as to what each particular section does and how it works. And it's been heavily commented and documented throughout. That way you know what section does what. So if you're interested in more information on that, check out the link, and it is a nice resource to take a look at. So let's talk about migration utilities. VMware provides what's called the vSphere Converter Standalone, and it's just a very simple standalone conversion utility, very easy. This is another area where I feel like VMware has done a better job with their conversion story than Microsoft has with Hyper-V. Microsoft, you have all kinds of different tools, some that work, some that are deprecated now. Now they're saying Azure Site Recovery, and then they weren't saying Azure Site Recovery. They just can't seem to have a cohesive method for doing virtual machine conversions into Hyper-V. VMware has always had this product. They've always stood by it, and it works for the vast majority of conversion tasks. So this is a free download. It can be used for the vast majority of conversion tasks. It can be run on a local machine or against a remote machine. It can be set up in a client-server agent fashion for more complex conversion jobs. And it will automatically convert the machine directly into a VMware VM running on an ESXi host, where on the Hyper-V side, most of the tools, they just create a virtual disk for you. You go create the VM yourself, attach it. You know, it's an easy step, but it's an extra step, whereas on the VMware side, they actually do that for you, which is kind of nice. There are alternatives. Like I said, the Converter Standalone will work for the vast majority of cases. But there are third-party options out there, and I always advise people, you know, if the workload is easily movable, sometimes it makes sense just to move it depending on what it is. So let's take a look at that. That's the standalone converter real quick. I've got it up right here, and if I go over here on my laptop, I have a VM running called MB Web 1. It's a Linux box, but I'm going to use the virtual machine converter to walk through the conversion process. You see, I had one I started here last night. I put that there, that way you could see how this utility will actually keep track of the task history. You can come in here and see all the different jobs as they've run, the log highlights, you know, task progress, et cetera, But to actually convert that existing machine, I'll come in here, and you can see I've already done it once or twice here since the utility has been run. But you can do this local machine, a remote Windows or Linux machine, whether it's powered on, powered off. In this case, I just put in the IP address. I authenticate to the box, again, hoping I don't fat finger it. If I want to view the details on that source, I can do that. And here, when you're converting a Linux box, it uses SSH. So you have to accept the thumbprint here. And here in a second, it'll retrieve the source information, and here I can see, okay, even though it's a VM, it thinks it's a physical box, but I can see it's Debian version 9, how many CPUs, all kinds of information regarding that machine. Click next. Now I actually point this at my vCenter instance. So I'm going to use my Active Directory account to authenticate to my VMware infrastructure. And now it's going to give me the option of, okay, where in that infrastructure do I want to place this newly created VM? This is a test and dev machine, so I'm going to put that there. And now it's going to give me the option, what storage do I want to use? What resource pool do I want to use? So again, it's test and dev. I want it to go on data store 2. I can change the virtual machine version here if I want. And then I can go to options. And this screen here that you're going to see in a second is really nice because it gives me the option of modifying a couple of different things. I can modify things like the volume size. So let's say, it's a 20 gig volume, but maybe I only want it to be 10 after the conversion. You can do things like that with this screen. I can change which network it's on, whether I want it to turn on or off after the conversion process. A lot of different things here. Once you're happy with your settings, you click next, come in here, you double check everything, you click finish, and it will actually submit the job. Now, I'm not going to do that for the sake of time, but that's really what a conversion process looks like when using the converter standalone. So that really kind of wraps it up for our content for today. I have just a couple of other things I wanted to show here. I want to talk about our product real quick. I'm going to give Lucas a chance to go through the remaining questions, see if he needs to answer any more. I'm going to talk about our backup product real quick, do a quick 2-3 minute demo, and then we'll do the Q&A here in just a second. So again, I mentioned earlier, our main product is Altera VM Backup. We really focus on a couple of different things: efficient backup setup. We want you to have full control of your backups, and we really focus on a very positive support experience. Our support team, I have nothing but fantastic things to say about those guys. So additionally, we have the best storage savings in the industry. In version 7, we introduced a new deduplication engine. And when we stack that up against some of our best competitors, we actually came out quite a bit ahead as far as storage space savings go. So we've been pretty happy about that. If you're interested in more information on that or checking out a trial, you can go to altera.com/vm-backup for more information. So let me show you a quick demo here. I'll just show you how easy it is to do a restore with our product. So this is our product here real quick. Again, we really focus on ease of use. So you can see here that we focus heavily on the UI and it being very easy to figure out where to go and how to get to certain areas when you're trying to figure things out. So what we can do, if I want to do a restore, this is the dashboard. I go over here to restore on the left-hand side. And I select, where's the backup stored. I'm going to select my primary backup location. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to select the virtual machine that I want to recover. So I will go with this one and hit next. And what it's going to do, it's going to scan all the different backups that are associated with that particular machine. And now I have to select, what version do I want to go to? So let's say I want to go back to Saturday, and I want to restore. This is, what's the name of the VM once it's restored? I'm just going to stick with the default. What host do I want to recover it to? Which data store do I want to recover it to? So we'll select data store 2 again, and whether or not I want the virtual NIC to be enabled or not. Once that's done, I just hit restore, and I can go back out to the dashboard and monitor the job in progress. So very easy to work through wizards, very simple and easy to figure out how to do things. So let's take a time. I want to get back over to the Q&A now. That way you guys have time to get your questions answered. Let me hop back over here and switch that around again. And then I will go over to the Q&A. So I see some people have been asking questions as they've been going through here. If you think of any questions, be sure to use the Q&A form in GoToWebinar to go ahead and ask them. And again, if I don't get to your question today, we don't get it answered, we always do that follow-up post afterwards, so keep an eye out for that out at altera.com/hyper-v. Or if you want to be notified for when that post is ready, you can go to altera.com/hyper-v/sign-up as well. So let me start taking a look through the questions here. All right. One question here is, we've got a user that has talked about using the standalone converter before and having to disable certain services to make it work properly. That is correct. That's a very good point. I found over the years that when you're trying to convert a machine into a VMware VM with standalone converter, if you have any high I/O services, SQL, antivirus especially is a big offender. Sometimes you have to disable those services during the conversion job. Otherwise, it messes with the I/O of the conversion job and it fails. So sometimes you have to disable those and re-enable them once the conversion job is done. So that's it's a good point to point out. Let's see here. Looking through the question list here. I've got a user here that mentioned that when they've tried to use the standalone converter, they convert a VM to Hyper-V, try to boot the newly created VM and no OS is found. So I've run into that before. The most common situation I've run into that in is when it's a Server 2003 machine. I run into that a lot with 2003 machines. Essentially what the problem is the 2003 boot image does not have the needed drivers to access the VMware storage. So essentially what you have to do is you have to boot into recovery mode and actually inject the VMware tools storage drivers into that operating system, and then it will be able to boot. That's been the most common issue that I've run into with that. I haven't found it to be a problem with newer operating systems though. So that's definitely one to watch out for if you're converting older machines. Let's see. I have a question here. Let's see. We have was there a webinar for migrating from VMware to Hyper-V? Yes, there was a webinar on that. It's out on our VMware blog. We recorded it. So if you are interested in going the other direction, VMware to Hyper-V, we've got a recorded webinar out on our VMware blog at altera.com/VMware. Let's see. Let's see. Are there any issues due to duplicated server instances after you've migrated from one source to another? So the user's asking, okay, I've just converted a virtual machine, but now it exists in the source and the destination. Potentially you could run into IP conflicts. But I don't know if you saw in that conversion utility, there was actually an option in the advanced settings where you could have the conversion utility turn off the source server after it's done and turn on the new server. So if you want to do that to ensure that you don't have IP conflicts, that's an option. By default, the conversion utility will leave the machines alone. It'll leave the new one, leave the old one powered on, and it'll leave that new one powered off so that you, the administrator, can manually go on and start and stop them when you're ready. So definitely that's a good observation. Good thing to keep an eye on. Let's see. I got an Altero question here. Can Veeam and Altero exist on the same host? They can. You just want to make sure that they're not operating during the same window. You don't want them to be doing backups at the same time. So that would be the only concern there. Let's see. A lot of people asking if the webinar has been recorded. Yes, we have recorded today's webinar, and it will be available for viewing on our follow-up post once again. And again, we can keep an eye out for that follow-up post out at altero.com/hyper-v. Let's see where we'll be putting the follow-up post. Let's see. Another question I've got here. If we're just getting started with VMware, what resources are available to help get ramped up? That's a good question. The main thing that I find when I'm trying to learn a new technology is to actually install it and get my hands on it. VMware does have product evals just like Microsoft does. Just go out to their website. You can sign up for an eval. They vary in their links. I want to say the ESXi eval is 120 days full featured. vCenter I want to say is a little bit shorter, 90, actually I think it's 60 actually. But after the 60 days, vCenter has to be licensed or it won't work. ESXi though, they do have a free version. It doesn't have all the bells and whistles, but it will continue to work after the fact, and obviously you don't get support or anything until it's licensed. So be sure to check out those evals. The other thing is VMware has a very active community site. You can go to communities.vmware.com, I believe is the address. And we have a very fully featured VMware blog out at altero.com/VMware. We've got a lot of great information there, a lot of great authors, very knowledgeable. Be sure to, if you have questions on an article, be sure to use the comments form, and our guys always get back to you quite readily. So another question here, what about containers? Microsoft is working on container development quite hard. Does VMware have anything similar? So yes, Microsoft is really hitting containers hard with Server 2016. VMware has container story as well. They have a container image that they call Photon OS, and they integrate with Docker as well. So I'm sure if you just do a Google search for Photon OS VMware container, something along those lines, you get all kinds of great information right off their website regarding that. But I do know that they're working on containers as well. I think we've got time for about one more here. Let me take a look. Let's see. Microsoft is including AV on all Windows Server 2016 deployments now. What do I need to worry about with VMware in regards to AV? So that's a good question. They're referring to the fact that in 2016, Microsoft now includes Windows Defender on all server installations. And it works pretty well. It's very low key. It does a good job. But they're wondering if there's anything they have to worry about with AV and VMware. And the answer there is no. That is one thing that's nice about VMware. They really run their own really stripped down, very secure OS for their hypervisors. So there's not really anything you have to worry about AV-wise. One thing that they do have in their product stack is a product called vShield Endpoint, and really what it allows you to do is it allows you to offload the antivirus scanning of your virtual machines to a virtual appliance, if you will, and you have to have a vShield aware antivirus solution in order to use it, but it works pretty well the times I've had to tinker with it. So that's it for our Q&A. Again, if I didn't get to your question, be sure to check that follow-up post, and we'll be sure to get you the answer along with the webinar recording and the copy of the slide deck as well. So with that, I want to be respectful of everybody's time. That kind of wraps things up for us today. So hope you have a great rest of your Tuesday, and thanks for attending, everyone. Really appreciate it, and hope you found the information helpful. So, all right, have a good one. Thank you much.